integrating VMware ThinApp into VMware View. And we're back. So this is kind of like part two to that immediately previous nugget that we spent really creating this ThinApp package. Okay, we went through all the sequencing steps where we did the pre-snapshot, and then we installed the software, and then we did the post-snapshot, and then we did the configuration, and then we built that package. And so what we have now is an installation package that we can deploy out to machines, but we haven't done anything with it. We haven't really made any changes to anything. If the content in that last nugget was really the art in this process, well, this nugget is more about the science. So we're going to spend time here actually ingesting this ThinApp and the metadata associated with this ThinApp into VMware View so that View can go about provisioning it to the virtual machines that make up the pools in our View infrastructure. So, there's not much left to talk about ThinApps themselves. Really at this point, I think I'd mentioned before that there's still some learning on your part, and it's nothing that I can sit here and instruct you on. It's stuff you kind of have to do via experience and via osmosis. So your first ThinApp package may not necessarily work right out of the box because there may be some things you need to add or subtract from that package in order to make it work. Maybe the capture didn't grab the right things, or maybe it grabbed a couple of things it shouldn't have. So figure out, spend some time with that packaging process and make sure that you really kind of come to grips with how to use it from just get some experience with it. Because that experience is going to dovetail directly into how you end up integrating that ThinApp and ThinApp templates into VMware View. So that's what this process is. Now in this nugget, we're going to spend pretty much the entirety of it, and there will be much less time spent in this nugget because, it's really just click here, then click here. Going through that whole process of integrating that ThinApp and creating a ThinApp repository and a file share, those sorts of things that kind of get the whole thing up and running. A couple things we have to do first. We do have to create what View calls a ThinApp repository. It is just a file share. The only thing that's really important about this file share are the permissions. We have to add the domain computers account. We have to give it read access. If we're going to be doing streaming, we have to give the user's account read and execute access to the NTFS permissions, to the share permissions. That's what's going to allow View to do what it needs to do. Okay, so and there are a couple of decisions that we'll have whenever we actually go about provisioning these ThinApps. So I'll let you know what all these different decisions are, because they're going to make a difference as to what that experience will be for users, and more or less whether or not the application will be already down at the virtual machine by the time the user needs it. That happens in this whole process of assigning ThinApps to VM pools and then working with templates. More or less, all you need to know is that one or more VMs can go to one or more pools, and if I want, I can collect a few ThinApps together into what I think of as a template. Okay, that's really all the excitement that we have there. So here inside of the View infrastructure, taking a look at the server vcon.company.pri, and looking over here at the View administrator, I have, just like before, I have my one pool. That pool is the linked clones pool. Okay, in that pool is one functioning virtual machine. So we got one VM that's ready for use. First thing we have to do before we do any of this, however, is to actually dig into just an available file server on this network and create that folder and share structure that's necessary so that the desktops can actually find those ThinApps whenever they're on the network. It's just creating a file or file share. So here under computer in the C drive, I'm just going to create a share here. I'll call it ThinApp. And for the share, I'm going to do a couple of security things in here. The user's account needs to have read and execute. Okay, the domain computers account here, domain computers account, then needs to have read access. Okay, so there's the read access. I'll leave read and execute on there as well. Same thing with the share. Okay, in this share, I'm going to create the share, call it ThinApp there, give it the right permissions, and then add in the domain computers group here. Okay, so domain computers. Read once again. Again, you'll lock this down when you get into your environment so that users can't get access to it. The everyone group isn't correctly or incorrectly assigned. I just need to set this up so that the applications, the ThinApp programs, the ThinApp packages, excuse me, can get accessed via vcon / and then ThinApp. Okay. So interestingly enough, this is a similar mechanism, so a similar series of steps that you would go through if you were deploying, for example, software through group policy, and also in a roundabout way via other tools like Configuration Manager, so on and so forth. So, all right, we've got the share set up. The next thing we need to do is to actually create the repository. So here under View Configuration, you see ThinApp configuration here. Okay, and the repository is just simply the file share that we just created. So here's a vcon repository, and the share path is vcon.company.pri/ThinApp. Okay, that's everything correct there. Hit the Save button, and everything goes well. You'll see that I have this repository that's now been created. Now, this process actually sets up the connection inside of VMware View Administrator so that administrator knows where to go to find the ThinApps. We haven't actually imported any ThinApps into View just yet. That actually happens up here under ThinApps. And you'll see there's a button here marked Scan New ThinApps. And so this tool very nicely will go through that file share, identify any of the MSIs that are available for use that can actually be used inside of VMware View, and then make those available down here on the bottom. Now, we haven't done anything yet. Okay, if we go back here to this location, you'll find that the ThinApp folder is still blank. What I need to do is actually go back to the computer where we created the ThinApp package. If you recall, this was back on client 1. Okay, and it's in the C, Program Files, x86, VMware ThinApp, and in the captures folder, you will see this 7-zip 9.20 item. Okay, this was the capture that we created here. So let me copy this over to the location, this ThinApp location here. Now what's interesting is you don't actually need the entirety of this folder. Remember that this contains all the stuff that corresponds to that ThinApp, and it's really there in an exploded form so that you can go about adjusting the things that you need to when you actually create the package with the build batch file here. What we actually need is here under bin. Okay, and it's these two, this executable file here, and then this MSI file. These are the two items that we need. Recall back in that last nugget when we were creating that ThinApp package, we had the option of, well, where did we want to essentially store the stuff? Did we want to do it in a separate DAT file, or did we want to do it in an executable file, an exe file? We chose an exe file, the 7-zip file manager file, and so this is the file that needs to go with this MSI file in this location. Let me actually kind of clear out some of the stuff here because we don't need all of this, and move these two files just back a level so that in the ThinApp location, so here under C, ThinApp 7-zip 9.20 is essentially the two files that we need. Okay, that's all that's really necessary. With that in that location, then I can go and choose the Scan New ThinApps button, and it'll allow me to essentially scan a repository. There's my vcon repository again, and inside the repository are going to be one or more folders. Now I can choose obviously here and just as the starting point for the scan. I know that all of my content is here in the 7-zip 9.20 folder, so I'll scan that location. There's the MSI that I want to add into View Administrator. There may be obviously more than one MSI. If I choose Scan, you can see that the scanning is completed and I've got a correct name and path, an MSI file, and a status of added here. If you make any mistakes, okay, if for some reason you put the MSI file and not the exe, or you miss some of the pieces that it needs, or if you forgot way back over here on client 1, if you forgot in that location to change the streaming bit from 0 to 1, this was back here under the package items down here, MSI streaming equals 1. If you forgot any of those things, then this will show up not as added, but instead as invalid. So this is essentially what we're going to add right here. Choose Finish. So here we go. I have ThinApp here. I have a vendor. I have the locations where this thing is currently assigned. So with this ThinApp now in place, okay, I can now then assign the ThinApp out to the various different items that I have, the objects here inside of View Administrator. Notice that I can do to either a pool or a desktop. So if I have the list of desktops here, right, here's VM001, the one existing desktop in the environment, I can just send it to that desktop. I'm more interested, however, because I want to, I want full automation here, in adding the assignment not just to the desktop, but to that linked clones pool here. Okay, that linked clones pool means that any of the desktops in that pool, no matter when I create them or where they are, as long as they're in the pool, well, then this assignment is going to exist, inserting that 7-zip application into the VMs on that pool. Now you notice down here at the bottom, there are two different types of installations. Okay, there's a streaming type and then there's a full type. Right, and when we were creating that package, we set that little bit inside of the INI file to 1 to support streaming. Now here's the important difference. It's whether or not you want that package installed down there, essentially pre-positioned down there, or if you want that package to stream down when the user attempts to run the piece of software. The thing about streaming is nice is if I choose streaming, then what View is going to do is supply all of the start points, the shortcuts, if you will, for this application on that machine. Okay, but it's not actually going to install the software until the user begins to use it. One of the big benefits about streaming with virtual applications is that streaming essentially sends down the bits that are necessary for that application to just get started first. And then it follows up with all the remaining bits. And so even though you'd say, well, wait a minute, I don't want the user to have to wait for that application to install, it really does so in a very nice fashion. That's kind of the whole notion of streaming, is that I can send them down in a more priority order. Big benefit is, remember, we are always in desktop virtualization trying to conserve storage space wherever possible. So if I go and I choose the full installation type, well, then that's actually going to begin the installation and copy the data down onto those virtual machines, which increases their size. So keeping things in streaming, and that may be something you want to do. I mean, again, this is up to you. If you have problems with streaming, or if it's a really big application, then you may just want to do it as full, or if storage space is not at a premium for you. But in streaming here, I have the shortcut down there. I save everything else for when that user needs to make use of that application. Choose the OK button. Okay, you see here now 7-zip 9.2 has one streaming assignment. And at this point, what's going to happen is VMware View is going to add to those virtual machines whatever shortcuts are necessary to support the beginning that installation, to beginning that streaming process down to those computers. I can also, if I want, right? As you can imagine, you can have a whole lot of these applications, right? I don't know, some people have a dozen applications under management. Some people have thousands of applications under management. So this list can get relatively large. And so in those cases, it may be useful for you to create templates. And the whole point of a template, if you think of it just like a folder, okay? Here's my ThinApps here, is the template that I create that just merely contains one or more applications. The template then becomes the thing that you assign as opposed to the individual application. Okay, these are the apps the finance people need. These are the apps that the marketing people need. These are the apps IT needs, whatever. These templates, again, containers for ThinApps. There is one thing left that we have to do, and that's, well, actually to see all of this work in action. So, all right, this pool, linked clones, has one VM, which is VM001. Okay, let's actually connect up to that VM001 computer here. I'm going to switch back over to client, and I have installed the VMware, where did it go? The VMware View client right here. Okay, we've seen this before. I'm going to log in as myself to vcon.company.pri. I'm going to connect up to the linked clones desktop that is existing out there in that pool. Okay, so what actually happened in the background? Right, so while we were working with this, what did View Server do? So let's click down here under the Start button here and choose All Programs, and you see now that there's a 7-zip icon that exists in the Start menu. Pretty cool, huh? So click that icon, click the 7-zip file manager, choose to run it. You'll see that it's actually downloading, right? And once it completes all the necessary download stuff, well, then it makes it available for me so that I can use 7-zip here inside of my virtual machine. Really, really exciting. This is, again, some of the really fun parts about making use of virtual applications is that they're there. And then if I want to get rid of them at some point, down the road, I can merely go here to ThinApps and choose that ThinApp and remove that ThinApp from the assignment to that virtual pool. Because I have that nice air gap between the application and the virtual machine, removing that ThinApp is not going to necessarily leave all that many artifacts in my virtual machines. Now, with all of this whole ThinApp infrastructure, there are additional steps that you can do for, if you have to update a ThinApp and how you would actually go about updating ThinApps. There are a number of different things that are involved with that process. They're kind of, admittedly, a little bit advanced, so I'm not going to dig into them here. But be aware that the whole process of working with these ThinApps, specifically in the upgrade world, has essentially you're going to be doing some work in the command line in order to do that. Okay, you're going to have to go and create different packages and maybe remove one package and add different packages. A lot of different ways to essentially to accomplish that, and there are reasons for one versus reasons for another. You'll notice here if I take a look at the ThinApp also, the 7-zip ThinApp here, I can edit some of the notes here associated with it. I can change assignments. I can view package information with that package. I can see what desktops it's currently associated with, and because I have that events database up and running, I can view the events database too with that ThinApp. Kind of admittedly very basic interface there. The levels of things that you would do with those ThinApps right inside of VMware View, relatively basic, but that's okay. I will point you towards the View Administrator's Guide for a little bit more of those specifics on how you can do updating of ThinApps. For me, I'll just go and create a new ThinApp and then remove the old ThinApp and add the new one in. Probably one of the easiest ways to do things. Anyway, what have we talked about in this nugget? We have talked about integrating VMware ThinApp into VMware View, and we started by talking about, okay, well, how do I create this metadata? The ThinApp objects and the ThinApp template objects inside of VMware View. And really, what is VMware View doing when I'm actually creating those objects? We spent some time talking about ThinApp repositories and file shares. We assigned that 7-zip ThinApp to the VM pool. We created a ThinApp template and showed you how a template is essentially a container for ThinApps. And then we took a look at our virtual machine and how when we assign that ThinApp, well, all of a sudden it just magically appears so that we can make use of that ThinApp as part of our user experience. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.